After 8 years of marriage with Andrew, we treated each other with respect, almost like courteous guests. When the car accident happened, he instinctively shielded me with his body. Just before his last breath, he told me, "Emily, I love you, but I'm sorry I can't stay by your side forever." Those words haunted my dreams almost every night. At 35, consumed by longing and unable to eat or sleep, I was diagnosed with cancer. I died on the operating table. Then, when I opened my eyes again, I found myself back on the eve of that accident, determined to stop him from going. I begged Andrew not to leave, but he still went. This time, he didn't get into an accident. Instead, he went to meet his true love, Clara, and planned to divorce me. The words he said before he died weren't meant for me. They were for her. When I blinked again, I woke up in Andrew's arms. The fresh kiss marks on his collarbone screamed of everything that had just happened. The pristine white room, his slightly furrowed brow, and his even breathing filled the space around me. My heart synchronized with his rhythm. "Now, where are we? What time is it?" Andrew rolled over, slipped on his robe, and walked toward the bathroom. The sound of water running brought my scattered thoughts back to the present. Glancing at my phone, I saw the date. It was the day before he was supposed to leave for his trip. According to the timeline I remembered, I would go with him, and we'd crash into a large truck. Those moments replayed vividly in my mind, suffocating me. Andrew emerged from the bathroom, droplets of water still clinging to his hair. He sat beside me and pulled me close, as if intending to carry me to the bathroom, wrapping my arms around his waist. I nestled into his embrace. The familiar scent of him enveloped me, calming my nerves. After a while, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly with tears, "Can you not go on the trip tomorrow?" He cupped my face, kissed me softly on the lips, and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong? Please don't go tomorrow." I pleaded, locking eyes with him. "I'll make your favorite steamed fish at home. Then we can take a walk together in the evening, and maybe visit Mom at the hospital. Would that be okay?" He didn't reply. Instead, he lifted me into his arms and carried me to the bathroom. I wanted an answer from him, but I drifted into sleep without hearing one. The next morning, he left home early. On the dining table, he had carefully prepared breakfast for me. Andrew had always respected my wishes. If I ever asked him not to do something, he would comply without question. After finishing breakfast and tidying up, I went to the market to buy groceries. My hands, unused to cooking for so long, fumbled, and I accidentally cut my finger. Blood flowed freely as unsettling thoughts circled in my mind, leaving me restless. At 7 p.m., I messaged Andrew, asking when he'd be back. There was no reply. At 8 p.m., I sent another message, but again, nothing. Finally, at 10 p.m., he replied, "Honey, I've arrived in Chicago." His words hit me like a heavy weight on my chest. Panicking, I called him. Through the phone, I heard laughter and the clinking of glasses. Summoning my voice, I asked, "Andrew, how did you get there? Did you fly?" He explained that he had taken a different mode of transportation this time, avoiding the circumstances of the previous timeline. Exhaling deeply, my heart settled, but fear still lingered. I couldn't shake the dread that something might still go wrong. I booked the next flight to join him. Only by staying close to him could I feel at ease. The flight was delayed due to a thunderstorm, and by the time I landed, it was already the following morning. Exhausted from a sleepless night, my thoughts were sluggish. As I exited the airport and got into a taxi, I realized I hadn't yet called Andrew. Dialing his number, I waited, but before he could speak, I heard a mechanical voice in the background. "B031. Please proceed to counter 1 for divorce registration." Before I could ask where he was, the line went dead. Moments later, I received a text. "Honey, I'm busy. I'll call you back later." Why would the CEO of an advertising company be at the Civil Affairs Bureau? I couldn't piece together the logic. My chaotic thoughts and mounting panic overwhelmed me. Calling his assistant yielded the same response. "He's busy." I wasn't even given the address. That moment, I felt all the strength leave my body. I called an old classmate who was familiar with Andrew and currently living in Chicago, asking for help locating him. They had met just yesterday, so there should still be some way to contact him today. 3 hours later, I learned Andrew's whereabouts. He wasn't at a hotel or a business meeting. He was in a residential neighborhood. The complex was chaotic, with buildings arranged haphazardly. It took me a long time to find the unit from the address I'd been given. The silent corridor was devoid of sound, save for the echo of my own footsteps. On the 3rd floor, I heard a familiar voice. Andrew's. He was speaking softly. Clara, don't be afraid. I'm here to take you to North City. I froze mid-step. So, he hadn't come to Chicago for the project. He had come for her. The name he had called out during his accident wasn't mine. It was hers. The person he couldn't let go of, even in death, was Clara. He was here to support her. Though the truth was painfully clear, I refused to accept it. My body trembled uncontrollably, but I couldn't take another step. I stood rooted to the spot, shaking, as I heard a voice inside ask him, "Will you divorce Emily?" "I will," Andrew replied gently. "Just give me a little more time." "Okay." His tone was soft, as if he were coaxing a rare and precious treasure. This was the same man who had slept in my bed just last night. A wave of nausea welled up inside me. Step by step, I approached the door. Through the mesh of the screen window, I saw them. Clara was the first to notice me. Her face paled, and she instinctively clutched Andrew's sleeve, hiding behind him. It took Andrew a moment to realize someone was outside. He didn't know how much I'd heard. His face showed no panic, just a fleeting flash of surprise before settling back into calm. He opened the door and faced me, expression unreadable. I stared at him, my heart a swirling storm of emotions, and finally asked, "Why are you really here in Chicago?" "Emily, listen to me," he began, his voice steady. "I came here for the project, and while I was here, I met up with an old friend I hadn't seen in years." He reached out to take my hand, but I stepped back, avoiding his touch, lowering my gaze. I let out a bitter laugh. Was discussing our divorce part of catching up with an old friend? For the first time, I saw him falter. He tried to explain, but no words came. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The reason he couldn't bring up divorce before was because he hadn't yet finished transferring assets. He had needed time, and I had been the fool all along. In our previous life, Andrew had called out my name before he died, but he never knew we had a child who also perished in that crash. He died. The baby was gone, and I spent every day consumed by agony. During the day, I'd force myself to sit in crowded places, watching people come and go, just to stave off the silence. But at night, the despair would crush me, leaving me in a state where I couldn't live or die. By the 2nd year, I had turned to alcohol. Not long after, I couldn't eat anything without throwing up. Within half a year, my body had wasted away completely. My health deteriorated rapidly, and I could only survive by relying on nutrient drips. It wasn't long before I was diagnosed with stomach cancer. I had no desire to fight for my life and eventually died on the operating table. The man who caused it all had spent his time thinking about divorcing me and using my money to support his so-called old friend. It was utterly ridiculous. Suppressing the wave of emotions, I took a step back and looked at both of them. In a soft voice, I said, "Andrew, I won't divorce you." The nausea I'd been holding back surged uncontrollably. I nearly ran downstairs, clinging to a tree outside the building as I dry heaved repeatedly. I felt as if my stomach bile was about to come up, and my chest seemed gripped by a giant hand, squeezing it so tightly that I could hardly breathe. But I couldn't show a single shred of vulnerability. At least not now. I hailed a cab outside the neighborhood and went to the nearest hotel. Once inside, I stepped into the bathroom, letting the icy water pour over me. Gradually, my thoughts began to settle. Memories of the previous life started surfacing, and I began piecing together the signs I'd missed. Andrew had rarely paid attention to his phone when he was home, but as his business trip to Chicago approached, his phone became his constant companion. If I so much as touched it, he would get visibly nervous. He even handed me a blank document, insisting it was the contract for the Chicago project and asking me to sign it. I trusted him, but I wasn't entirely naive. That's why I had followed him to Chicago. Now, thinking back on it, that blank document was probably the final page of a share transfer agreement. If I had signed it, everything I had worked for over the years would have been gone in an instant. I dried myself off, lay on the bed, and stared at the ceiling, feeling only waves of bitter cold sweeping through me. Lying there, I was overcome with fragments of memory. Andrew's image lingered in my mind when I closed my eyes. I remembered how he had spoken so sweetly when we got married. "Emily, I'll protect you for the rest of my life." How long was the rest of my life? I thought it would be decades, but it turned out to be just a few years. In my dreams, everything dragged me into an abyss, pulling me deeper. I woke up late at night, feeling a little hungry. I went out to grab some food and, by coincidence, saw Andrew with Clara. They each held a child's hand, looking every bit like a happy family of 3. My hand instinctively moved to my stomach, and I took a step back. Even though I knew the child wasn't Andrew's, my heart still couldn't accept it. Andrew didn't love me, so naturally, he wouldn't have loved my child either. Perhaps my child was never meant to exist in this world. But I had spent an entire year preparing for pregnancy, and when I finally conceived, it had felt like a miracle. Tears rolled down my cheeks as sadness consumed me. I made my decision that very night. I took the next flight back to North City, went home, packed my things, and headed straight to the hospital. The child I was carrying had no future. I called my best friend, Lily, to accompany me, telling her only that I needed her support without explaining why. Sitting on the toilet in the hospital, I felt the dampness below me. It was as if my body was being torn apart. Tears blurred my vision, and in my mind's eye, I saw myself as the brash 20-year-old who had once told Andrew, "Don't be afraid. I have money. What's mine is yours. Andrew, go for it. Even if you make mistakes, it's okay. You're the best husband in the world." One memory after another flashed before me, slipping through my fingers like shooting stars. I couldn't hold on to anything. They came and went as if mocking me. Lily, who had never seen me in such a state, sat by my side silently, her own tears streaming down her face. She didn't ask what had happened, only said, "Emily, don't be afraid. I'm here." In the dead of night, I regained some clarity. The darkness surrounding me was overwhelming, but my thoughts had never been sharper. Andrew and I had always wanted a child, but the heavens weren't kind to us. Despite trying for a long time, there was no progress. Yet ironically, when he decided to give up on me, I suddenly became pregnant. I wondered, how would he feel now, watching his own child leave this world? I wanted to know the answer, so I sent him all the medical reports. As I held the stack of papers in my hand, flipping through them over and over, tears streamed from my eyes. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand, making it hard to breathe. It took a long time before I could calm myself down. In this situation, the most innocent person wasn't me. I had chosen this man, this marriage, and this child. No one had forced me, but my unborn child had no choice. Wiping away my tears, I looked at myself in the mirror, splashing cold water on my face. I forced myself to sober up. I couldn't let sorrow consume me. Everything Andrew had now was because of me, and I intended to take it all back. I repeated this resolve to myself. On the 3rd day at the hospital, Andrew came. He strode straight to my room, standing over me and looking down with eyes bloodshot and filled with sorrow as if he had lost something important. But I knew better. He didn't truly care about the child we had lost. This display was just an act. I sat up in bed and looked at him. It was a long time before he finally spoke. "Where's the baby?" I didn't answer, and he grabbed my hand, anger written all over his face. "Emily, that was my child. How could you make such a decision without consulting me? How could you be so cruel? So selfish?" His voice boomed through the room, reverberating with echoes. I simply sat there, quietly listening. Andrew and I had been college classmates. His family background was modest, and his living allowance was barely enough. While others were out having fun, he was often working part-time jobs. He worked at least 2 shifts a day. We didn't interact much, except for occasionally teaming up for major projects. Later, he began asking me to partner with him for group assignments and even started bringing me meals to my dorm. When he found out I had a fever, he went out late at night to buy me medicine. During my internship, when I had to work overtime, he would pick me up from the office. Though his family background wasn't great, He had good personal qualities. He was attractive and well-educated. Slowly, I found myself liking him. When my father learned that I was dating him, he was furious. "Stay away from him," he said. "He's not good enough for you. If he's pursuing you, it's because he has ulterior motives. A marriage without benefits is like sand. It won't hold together. Your marriage isn't something you can decide on your own." His tone was harsh, like a brick striking my chest. I had grown up surrounded by love and privilege. Yet suddenly my father was telling me that the fortress of love he had built for me was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. Was I meant to bury myself in it? On what grounds? I stared at Andrew with unwavering eyes and asked, "Then who makes the decisions?" The air grew heavy with silence. He didn't answer. My mother tried to comfort me, saying, "He didn't mean it. Don't take it to heart." But I felt like a commodity, something to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. Andrew didn't have money, so he wasn't worthy. Maybe it was out of defiance. Or maybe I wanted to prove that Andrew had no ulterior motives. I proposed to him. I stole the household registration booklet from my mother's hands and went to register our marriage. When my father found out, he slapped me hard and told me never to return home again. After that, for many years, my family and I lost contact. To support Andrew's business ventures, I sold my car, my house, even my designer bags. Bit by bit, I used my money and connections to build a ladder for him to climb. My mother, hearing about my situation from others, started helping me secretly out of pity. Even my father, despite his harsh words and dislike for Andrew, quietly brought projects to Andrew's company. I knew the real reason behind it all. They pitied me and wanted me to have a better life. Nothing more. After years of fighting against my parents, I finally understood who around me was genuine and who was not. Listening to Andrew hurl insults at me, I felt nothing. He ranted for a full 2 minutes before finally stopping. I looked at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of my lips. "You already have a child, don't you? I saw you out shopping together just a few days ago. Wasn't that your child?" He leaned down, grabbing my collar, and the hatred in his eyes pierced me. But I couldn't show even a shred of pain. "Emily, I want a divorce," he said. I pushed his hand away and let out a quiet laugh. "I want all the cash and shares cashed out. Otherwise, I'll drag you down with me." I knew Andrew too well. He wouldn't act rashly without knowing the full extent of what I had in my hands. He was too cautious, always calculating. This trait had its advantages. He was thorough and meticulous, achieving near perfection in everything he did. But it also held him back. He couldn't take risks because he overthought everything. Smiling, I said, "Think it through before coming back to me. And when you do, I hope you bring good news." As I watched his retreating figure, my smile slowly faded. My hands clenched tightly, the pain in my palms finally bringing me back to my senses. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital and returned home. The house was eerily quiet. Without a single sound, I curled up on the couch, staring in the direction of Andrew's study. When we moved into this house, we had set up 2 studies, one for him and one for me. Andrew had said we both needed personal space. Out of respect for him, I had never entered his study. But today, I suddenly wanted to know what secrets lay hidden in his room. The layout of our studies was almost identical, but his had a safe. I didn't know the combination and couldn't open it, so I called a locksmith. Inside the safe, there was a photo album, an old phone, and a ring. The ring was a woman's ring, but it wasn't mine. The photo album was filled with pictures of Clara, spanning from middle school through high school graduation. In the safe, there were more photos, all from important moments in Andrew's life, including our wedding. I clenched the ring in my hand and turned on the old phone. The screen lit up, revealing images of a younger Andrew, his youthful face filled with vigor. Beside him in nearly every photo was Clara, often leaning close to him, her presence unmistakable. As I scrolled further, a video started playing. Clara was laughing brightly, her smile radiant as she turned to Andrew and asked, "Andrew, who do you like the most?" "Of course, it's you, Clara." The Andrew in the video replied without hesitation, his voice filled with the candidness and loyalty of youth. I had never seen Andrew like this. In my memory, He was always calm, mature, and unflappable. He never lost his composure over trivial matters. And he certainly wasn't someone who would easily utter words like, "I like you." But now I understood. It wasn't that he found it hard to say those words. It was that he didn't feel that way about me. I let out a long, heavy sigh, moving to stand by the window and looking down at the street below. So, from the very beginning, his intentions in approaching me hadn't been pure. And yet, I had walked willingly into the trap he'd set for me. When Andrew returned home, he found the house in disarray. He silently tidied everything, putting things back in their place before walking up to me and extending his hand. I looked at his outstretched hand and smiled faintly. He wanted the ring, but I had no intention of giving it back. I walked toward the bathroom, the ring still between my fingers. Andrew followed closely, his face filled with urgency. Just as he was about to snatch the ring, I moved faster, letting it slip from my hand into the running water, watching as it disappeared down the drain. That moment, he raised his hand. The slap didn't land on my face, but it felt as if it had. I let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down my face. "You want the ring? Go fish it out of the septic tank if you can," I said softly. "Emily, you deserve to be abandoned by everyone." He spat, his voice cold and heavy. The word struck me like a blow. Everything I had sacrificed for him, all that I had done, was now being used as ammunition against me. Raising my hand, I slapped him hard across the face. "Andrew, it was you who made the mistakes, not me." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. "What mistake did I make? I didn't have an affair. I just want a divorce. What's wrong with that?" He walked into the study, rummaged around for something, and returned 2 minutes later with 2 documents in hand. He placed them on the coffee table in front of me. They were divorce agreements, already prepared. My hands trembled as I picked them up, carefully reading through the terms. He was giving me all the cash, 2 properties, and 30% of the company shares, to be converted into cash value. He had agreed to all of my conditions. I picked up the pen and signed my name where indicated. Then, I handed the pen and the agreement to him. He signed his name without hesitation. "I'll pick you up tomorrow to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau," he said calmly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Andrew and I sat in the same space without arguing. The next day, I sat in the passenger seat, staring out of the window in silence. Questions swirled in my mind, too many to make sense of. After a long pause, I finally asked, "When did you and Clara reconnect?" He furrowed his brow and replied, "Does it even matter anymore?" "It doesn't," I admitted. "But I want to know." I didn't wait for his response, and he, seemingly resigned, continued speaking on his own. "Believe it or not, it doesn't change anything. I never thought about divorcing you. Clara and I have nothing between us. Her husband cheated on her, but she refused to divorce him. She asked me for help. What happens between us has nothing to do with her. Before Clara appeared, while we weren't deeply in love, we were respectful and considerate of each other. But the moment she came back into your life, you lost focus. All your thoughts revolved around her." I looked at Andrew and asked, "Do you love her?" The question hung in the air, met with silence. His silence confirmed the truth. The love from one's youth often leaves the deepest impressions, impossible to forget. We signed the divorce cooling-off agreement, and he offered to take me home. Standing outside the Civil Affairs Bureau, we watched couples come and go. My heart was filled with endless sighs. Years ago, we had walked through these doors hand in hand, thinking only of how to build a good life together. No one gets married with the intention of divorcing. I shook my head at him and said, "You don't need to take me." I took a cab home, and the past flashed before my eyes. In the previous life, I kept my illness a secret. By the time my mother found out, it was already in the late stages, with little hope of recovery. She cried so much during that time that her eyes were nearly blind. Day and night, she knelt in front of the Buddha, praying only for my health and long life. Even my strict and stoic father turned gray-haired overnight. And me? I had thrown away my life for so-called love, ruining not just my future but also the remainder of my parents' lives. If I had known from the start that Andrew went to Chicago for Clara, I wouldn't have been so heartbroken that I couldn't eat. I wouldn't have gotten stomach cancer, nor would I have died young on an operating table. I would have lived a good life, maybe even found a younger husband, had a child, and lived healthily to 80. Thankfully, everything has changed, and there's still time to make things right. Everything Andrew has now came from me, and he'll have to return it all. The new year was approaching, and the streets were festively decorated. In previous years, Andrew and I would have gone on a trip together, returning to his hometown just before the holiday. But this year, the house was empty, just me. I curled up on the sofa, reading Clara's information. She and Andrew had grown up together, childhood sweethearts. In college, she attended a school in Chicago, and they lived apart. Though they weren't in a relationship, they became each other's unattainable first love. Later, Andrew and I got married. 6 months after our wedding, Clara also got married. Her life after marriage was ordinary, uneventful, until her husband cheated on her. That was when she reconnected with Andrew. The first time they contacted each other was half a year ago. Coincidentally, that was also when Andrew handed me that blank document to sign. It all made sense now. Clara's divorce had stirred something in Andrew. He began quietly transferring assets and plotting to steal my shares. I placed the laptop on the coffee table and went to pour myself a glass of water. Just then, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I was stunned to see my parents standing there. My father's expression was stern, his displeasure written all over his face. My mother quickly said, "Don't scare Emily, please." Her face was calm, her hair dark without a single trace of gray. In that instant, it felt as though everything had shifted. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I tried my best to calm myself down. The moment I opened the door, however, I couldn't hold them back. "Oh dear, what's wrong?" my mom said as she pulled me into her arms. "It's okay now, sweetheart. When were you planning to tell us about the divorce? And when are you coming home for the new year?" "Emily, you..." My dad's scolding tone hadn't even finished when my mom interrupted him. "Why are you like this? You promised to speak calmly before we got here. Why do you always have to yell?" She gave him a sharp look, and my dad fell silent immediately, grumbling under his breath as he turned away. "Go pack your things. You're coming home for the new year," my mom said firmly. "Okay." I returned to my bedroom and grabbed a few pieces of clothing. I hadn't been home in years, and now, everything felt unfamiliar. Before I got married, we had a housekeeper, and I'd never cooked a meal in my life. Whenever I suggested cooking something for my mom, she'd always say, "No need to learn how to cook. You were born to enjoy life. Otherwise, what's the point of your dad earning so much money?" But after getting married, I not only learned how to manage household chores but also how to cook. First, I burned myself several times, blisters forming on my hands. Over time, I got better at it. Back at my parents' house, I went to my old room to put my things away. Nothing had changed, not even the handbags I'd bought years ago, still sitting neatly in the closet. My mom leaned against the doorframe, a soft smile on her face. "Your dad may be stubborn, but don't you know how much he loves you? He's missed you all these years. Yet you've refused to come home." Tears slid down my cheeks. Memories, like seeds, had grown slowly during our time apart. But now, after seeing them again, they burst forth uncontrollably. Seeing me cry, my mom's heart ached. She walked over, wiped my tears gently, and said softly, "It's enough that you've come home." That evening, my parents prepared a feast of all my favorite dishes. Even the housekeeper teared up when she saw me. Every year during the holidays, your parents would say how much they wished you'd come home, the housekeeper said. Your dad's regretted his words for a long time now. He always says he shouldn't have talked about cutting ties with you. But words, once spoken, are like water spilled. They can't be taken back, no matter how much you regret them. And I, having inherited my father's stubbornness, couldn't bring myself to admit fault either. Once I left, I swore I wouldn't bow my head and apologize. In my last life, I missed out on so much. I didn't spend enough time with my parents before leaving this world. After dinner, my dad called me into his study. We stood there in silence, neither of us knowing what to say. 3 minutes passed before he cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Emily, your mom and I only have one daughter, and we're getting old. We always thought the company would go to you and Andrew someday. But now, do you have any plans for yourself? I do, I said firmly. Dad, you don't need to worry about me. I'm fine. As long as you have a plan. That's all that matters. He opened a drawer and pulled out a card. It was the one I used before getting married. When I severed ties with him, I had returned the card and said I'd rather starve than use a single penny from home. My dad pushed the card toward me, opening his mouth to say something but falling silent again. I didn't take it. Instead, I said softly, Dad, I have money. You don't need to worry about me. I noticed his eyes were slightly red, filled with a deep sense of pain. You've grown up, he said. Yes, I've grown up after enduring so much hardship I never should have faced. I replied. That night, as I listened to the chirping of birds outside my window, I couldn't sleep. Everything felt like it was just beginning. I spent the new year at home with my parents, then accompanied them on a short trip to nearby cities. After finalizing the divorce with Andrew, my life returned to a quiet routine. I fell into a simple, 2-point routine, commuting between home and the office. One day, while at home, I received a call from a courier saying I had a package. I couldn't remember ordering anything, so I asked him to forward it to me. When I opened it, I found an invitation. Andrew and Clara were getting married at the end of the month. The invitation was from Clara. It was a taunt. My temples throbbed as anger welled up inside me. I couldn't suppress it no matter how hard I tried. The housekeeper brought me a glass of water, noticed my pale expression, and quietly left without asking questions. After thinking about it for a long time, I decided I would go. I even prepared a wedding gift for them. On the day of the wedding, I wore a red dress and did my makeup meticulously. The moment Andrew saw me, his face changed instantly. Many of the guests recognized me and began whispering amongst themselves. Amidst the murmurs, Clara approached me with a gentle smile. I thought you wouldn't come. How could I not? I looked at her. As Andrew's ex-wife, I had to come and wish you both a happy marriage. Didn't I? I handed a document to Andrew. Here's my wedding gift to you too. It's the termination agreement between Lynn Group and Bay Advertising. Years ago, my father had signed a 10-year exclusive contract with Andrew's company, entrusting all of our advertising to them. Now that Lynn Group was under my control, I decided to end the partnership. Every time I saw the company's name, I felt sick. The name Bay Advertising had been chosen as a play on both Andrew's and my names. But now I realized it wasn't about me at all. It was because Clara and I shared the same final character in our names. That was why he'd suggested it. Andrew tried to open the document, but I stopped him, pressing his hand down. Wait until tonight to read it. It's a big gift. If you see it now, it'll ruin the surprise. With that, he handed the document to his assistant without looking at it. Then he and Clara went backstage to prepare for the ceremony. I had no interest in watching them exchange vows promising a lifetime together, so I left the venue. After returning home, I threw myself into work and tried to forget everything. 3 days later, Andrew came to find me. When the receptionist's call reached my desk, I froze for a moment, surprised he had shown up so quickly. I refused to meet him, but he stayed in the lobby, waiting for me. During all the years we were married, Andrew only knew my family was well off. He never realized I was the heiress of Lynn Group. He had never even met my parents. Even the contract with his company had been signed by the head of our advertising department. After work, as I took the elevator downstairs, I noticed Andrew waiting in the lobby. He had been there all day, and for the next 2 days, he continued to wait for me. Lynn Group was Bay Advertising's largest client. Many other clients had only signed contracts with Andrew because of our partnership. If Lynn Group terminated its contract, those companies would likely follow suit, severing ties with Bay Advertising. In essence, I was about to ruin his company's reputation in the industry. On the 3rd day, as I headed to a meeting, Andrew barged into the room. Our eyes met from across the space, and I saw the moment he spotted me. He froze, his entire body trembling. It wasn't until someone beside him reminded him, "Vice President, this is the CEO of Lynn Group you've been asking to meet," that he came back to his senses. I walked straight up to him, extending my hand. "Long time no see, Andrew." His fists clenched tightly. and after a few seconds, he reluctantly shook my hand, his voice stiff. "Long time no see. Andrew," I said with a smile, patting him on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning. The real challenge is ahead. You'd better prepare yourself." I released the news about terminating the contract with Bay Advertising. Many companies, seeing Lynn Group's withdrawal, announced they wouldn't be renewing their contracts with Andrew's company either. Those still on the fence decided not to consider him further. Andrew found himself in a precarious position. He wanted to ask for my help but didn't know how to approach me. 6 months later, his company, once profitable, began hemorrhaging money. Unable to sustain the losses, he eventually came to me. He stood outside my house, lighting cigarette after cigarette. My father had someone chase him off, but Andrew simply moved a little further away and continued to wait. He stayed there for 3 days. I refused to see him, but instead, Clara showed up. She stood outside my office building, crying and causing a scene, accusing me of stealing her husband. A crowd gathered to watch, many recording the incident on their phones. She was visibly pregnant, which made the security guards hesitant to forcibly remove her. Worried about the situation making headlines, I finally went downstairs. As soon as I stepped outside, she knelt in front of me. "Emily Lynn, you know Andrew is married now, don't you?" she sobbed. "Can't you stay away from him for the sake of my pregnancy?" Her tearful plea made her look pitiful, and the murmurs from the onlookers grew louder. Some said I didn't look like the type of person who would do such a thing. Clara was trying to use public opinion to pressure me. She was clever, but her cleverness often veered into foolishness. I walked up to her slowly and asked softly, "Did you know Andrew was married before? Did you know when you got involved with him that we hadn't even divorced yet? And when you were wrecking my marriage, did you know I was pregnant too?" Clara didn't listen to a word I said. She just kept crying and begging me to stay away from Andrew. Annoyed, I shook her hand off and had someone call Andrew. When Andrew arrived and saw Clara, he walked straight over and pulled her to her feet. His voice boomed as he yelled, "Can you stop causing a scene?" His tone was so loud and harsh that Clara flinched, her body trembling. She seemed shocked. She had probably never seen Andrew like this before. She tried to lean on him, but he pushed her away. After a long silence, he finally said, "If I had known you'd turn out to be such a disaster, I would have never gotten involved with you in the first place." Clara stared at him in disbelief, her body shaking even more. She no longer resembled the radiant bride she had been at the wedding. Their marriage, barely half a year old, was already in shambles. The so-called perfect first love had turned into just another mundane relationship once reality set in. It was almost laughable. Andrew tried to approach me to speak, but I didn't even glance at him. I walked straight to the elevator. Their relationship had nothing to do with me, and I had no intention of getting involved. They could sort it out however they pleased. Andrew's attempts to secure funding failed, and one by one, his investors pulled out. His company was left with no options. Either I would acquire it, or he would have to declare bankruptcy. I had my people negotiate a deal to purchase the company at a low price. After some back and forth, Andrew eventually agreed. But as I held the pen in my hand, ready to sign the papers, I suddenly felt a wave of disinterest. I looked up at Andrew and said, "I've thought it over and decided this company isn't worth anything to me." I capped the pen, set it down, and stood up to leave. Andrew followed me, calling out, "Emily, wait." He tried every conciliatory word he could muster, but his tone gradually grew impatient. "Emily Lynn, are you just playing me?" I stopped in my tracks, turned back, and smiled at him. "And if I am, what can you do about it? What do you have left to play with now?" Andrew had nothing. In a few months, his only option would be bankruptcy, followed by debt liquidation. I took 2 steps closer to him and looked him in the eye. "Andrew, soon you won't even have the right to meet me. If you have something to say, you'd better say it now." He stared at me silently, regret written all over his face. But it was too late. Clara's child was gone. Word had it that one afternoon, after discovering Andrew hadn't come home, she confronted him. During their argument, he pushed her, and she fell. That was all it took. I knew she was in the hospital, so I brought a fruit basket and went to see her. Her room was empty except for her. I placed the basket on the bedside table, stood by her bed, and looked down at her. "Didn't you think about this outcome when you reached out to Andrew?" I asked. Her face was pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked pitiful, the kind of person who would evoke sympathy. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "If I had known it would come to this, why would I have come to North City at all?" She had grown up in Chicago, where all her friends and family lived. The only reason she came to North City was that she believed Andrew would treat her well. But men change too easily. When I contacted Andrew, I never expected him to be with me. I just wanted his help with my divorce," she murmured. Then she looked at me, her voice trembling. "But he said he wanted to divorce you and marry me. How could I not believe him?" I interrupted her. "I came today just to see your downfall." Her current misery was entirely self-inflicted. While I felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction, I also felt a pang of pity. I walked out of the hospital leisurely and went home to have dinner. My parents were waiting for me. After dinner, I returned to the office to handle work. Life became busy and calm once more. For a long time, there was no news about Andrew. The next time I saw him was at a banquet. He was there trying to attract investors. He was no longer the rising star of the business world. No one greeted him. Even when he tried to strike up conversations, people avoided him. As I passed by, he grabbed my wrist. His eyes met mine, filled with desperation. "Emily, can't you help me? For the sake of what we once had." Hearing his plea, I felt nothing but irony. When I had been good to him, he had taken it for granted, believing that as his wife, it was my duty. But now, I wasn't his wife anymore. Why should I help him? I pulled my hand away and took 2 steps back. "I'm sorry, Vice President. There's nothing between us to warrant such a favor." I turned and walked away, leaving him trailing after me. Not long after, I heard that Andrew had officially declared bankruptcy. The bank had begun liquidating his assets. Another year passed quickly. Time really does fly. This year, for the new year, I booked a private dining room at a restaurant so we wouldn't have to cook at home. When the food arrived, the server turned out to be Andrew. He was wearing a waiter's uniform. When he saw me, he froze for a moment before approaching my father to pour him tea. "Sir, here's your tea." The moment my father saw Andrew, his brows furrowed tightly. Hearing Andrew's voice only deepened his disdain. My father grabbed the teacup and splashed its contents on Andrew. "Get out. Send someone else," he ordered coldly. The commotion brought the restaurant manager rushing in. He grabbed Andrew and pulled him out of the room. Later, when I went to the restroom, I ran into Andrew. He said, "I regret it." But I acted as if I didn't hear him and walked straight out. What did his regret have to do with me? My life would only get better from here, and there would be no further ties between us. Andrew's perspective. I met Emily Lynn in college. First, we didn't know each other well. She only approached me when she needed another teammate for a group project. She was a radiant person, always laughing boldly. Whenever we worked together, she would say, "We're missing one person for the project. Join our team." I would always agree without hesitation. Whenever we met, she'd bring coffee for everyone in the group. She carried a different designer bag every day, each rumored to cost thousands. Every piece of clothing she wore was equally expensive. Everyone said Emily came from a wealthy family, and that anyone lucky enough to date her must have accumulated blessings in their past life. I began to get closer to her. Beyond group projects, I started bringing her breakfast and lunch. When I learned she had a high fever, I delivered medicine to her late at night. On rainy days, I would pick her up when she went out. The closer we got, the better she treated me. In our graduation year, I confessed my feelings to her, and our relationship progressed quickly. Before I was even ready, she proposed to me. We married soon after. By our 3rd year of marriage, I decided to start a small business. However, I didn't have any startup funds. Over the years, Emily had changed. She no longer bought luxury goods and often stayed away from her family. I tried to convince her to mend her relationship with her family, but she always changed the subject. When I suggested meeting her parents, she said, "Not yet. It's not the right time." I didn't know when that time would ever come. When I started my business, she sold our home and her expensive bags to support me, giving me a large sum of money. We moved into a rental apartment. The company took off quickly, securing a large order within 6 months. My social engagements increased, which started causing friction between us. We began arguing, but I always ended up giving in. By our 8th year of marriage, I received a call from my high school classmate, Clara. No one knew that I had always harbored feelings for her. We had never been in a relationship but shared a mutual fondness. Clara was my secret. When she called, I felt an overwhelming urge to see her. I wanted to fly to Chicago immediately, but Emily asked to come with me. Reluctantly, I agreed. Few days later, she asked if I could cancel the trip. No, I replied. I need to see Clara. I want to. So badly. My desire reached a breaking point. Without telling Emily, I went to Chicago and met Clara. I told her I wanted to divorce Emily and asked her to wait for me. I didn't expect Emily to catch us. In a way, it was better. It saved me the trouble of initiating a divorce. She demanded all our cash, properties, and the liquidation of her shares. I agreed to all her conditions, and we divorced. After the divorce, Emily, who had seemed so ordinary and mediocre in her career, suddenly became the CEO of Lynn Group. Her first action as CEO was to terminate our company's contract. It was then that I learned the truth. The reason my company had risen so quickly was because of her connections and resources. She was the heiress of Lynn Group. And now, she was taking back everything, piece by piece. I begged her to show mercy, to let me go for the sake of our past. But she didn't. She severed all ties with ruthless efficiency, as if our relationship had never happened. Meanwhile, Clara caused scenes outside Emily's office, crying and shouting. In that moment, my regret reached its peak. I shouldn't have betrayed Emily Lynn. I shouldn't have divorced her. And now, I had lost everything. Absolutely everything. The day of the car accident was meant to be a family picnic. My husband, Jason Joe, was driving. I sat in the back seat with my son, Ethan Joe. Just before we exited the tunnel, Ethan mentioned that the door on his side felt loose and asked me to check it. Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned toward him. But before I could identify the problem, the next moment, the car lost control and crashed to one side. Instinctively, I shielded Ethan, protecting him from the shards of glass as the back window shattered. Unfortunately, since I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, the car's violent tumble off the highway threw me out of the vehicle. As I lay there, severely injured and barely alive, I heard a chilling conversation. "Dad, is she dead?" Ethan's voice asked with unsettling indifference. "Don't worry. She's definitely dead," Jason replied, his tone cold, as if I were a stranger. "Great. So, can we finally bring my real mom home?" Ethan asked eagerly. "Not yet. Let's take care of her funeral first," Jason responded. "Oh, right. The insurance. Dad, once we get the money, let's take a family trip abroad. Mom's always wanted to visit Korea." "Sure. Whatever you and your mom want," Jason replied casually. I burned with anger, but I couldn't stop my life from slipping away. Eventually, I unwillingly closed my eyes, filled with resentment. Perhaps the heavens pitied me, as I woke up to find myself reborn on the day Jason brought Ethan home for the first time. Everything could still be changed. This was the 7th year of our marriage. Jason had just returned from a business trip, unexpectedly bringing a young boy home with him, Ethan, the son I had doted on in my past life. Watching my mother-in-law, Susan Joe, treat Ethan with such familiarity and affection, I couldn't suppress a cold smile. So, everyone knew, and I was the only one left in the dark. Jason handed Ethan to Susan and then pulled me into the living room. "Helen, I want to talk to you about something," Jason began. In the living room, he told me Ethan's tragic backstory. He's 5 years old. His parents are unknown. He grew up with his grandmother, but now that she's passed away, he's become an orphan and started wandering. He's had such a rough life. I couldn't bear to leave him like that, so I brought him home. In my previous life, I had been moved to tears by this explanation. I praised Jason for his kindness and immediately agreed to adopt Ethan. But now, how could I let him get his way? Jason continued his act, pretending to be conflicted and listing various considerations before tentatively suggesting, "Honey, how about we adopt him?" The moment he finished, Susan glanced into the living room, clearly eavesdropping. Smiling warmly, I replied in a gentle tone, "No, let's have Mom adopt him instead. He can be your little brother." Jason's expression froze, as if he had swallowed a fly. Awkwardly, he tried to correct me. "Don't joke like that. Mom's too old for that." Susan, who had been listening intently, turned pale. She had heard every word. Without giving them a chance to argue further, I rubbed my temples and excused myself. "I'm very tired today. I'm going to bed." Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The man beside me harbored such venomous intentions, and in my previous life, I had been utterly blind to them. Thinking back, Ethan was 5 years old, meaning Jason had been unfaithful right at the start of our marriage. Jason's father had passed away when he was young, and his mother had raised him alone. When we met, his family was still burdened with debt, but because Jason seemed honest and treated me well, I didn't mind. Early in our marriage, we agreed to focus on work and postpone having children. That was how we ended up delaying. Until Ethan appeared. Jason Joe had brought Ethan into our home. He was obedient, understanding, and pitifully well behaved. Over time, I had genuinely accepted him, but later, I became pregnant. Ethan ran away from home several times, and each time, he narrowly escaped danger. I tried to communicate with him, but he resisted every effort. At the time, Susan Joe packed her things and threatened to take Ethan back to the countryside, crying that she couldn't stay in the city under my watchful and disapproving eyes. Then Jason, feigning a pained and conflicted expression, repeatedly argued that we should wait until Ethan was older before having another child. The constant pressure eventually caused me to lose the baby. Thinking back on it now, it was all too clear. They had conspired to harm my unborn child. A tear slipped silently from the corner of my eye in the darkness. That car accident, that life insurance policy Jason had insisted on, everything was part of their plan to kill me. But when did the idea of using Ethan to scam me truly begin? Was it after Jason brought Ethan home? Or had our entire marriage been a sham from the start? And who was this real mom they kept mentioning? Was she Ethan's biological mother? So, who was she? Saturday morning arrived, and I woke up early. Ethan was already sitting quietly on the couch. When he saw me, he greeted me sweetly. "Good morning, Auntie." I stared at him for a long time before slowly reaching out to pinch his cheek. He froze, not daring to move. When Jason walked out and saw what I was doing, he was visibly startled and hurried to stop me. "Helen, let's eat breakfast," he said anxiously. I let go. A faint red mark remained on Ethan's soft, delicate cheek. What an adorable child. I smiled faintly, the meaning of my expression unclear. Jason couldn't hide the concern in his eyes as he stepped forward, gently tousling Ethan's hair before ushering him to the dining table. After breakfast, Jason once again brought up the adoption. I casually replied, "I'll think about it," and left it at that. Then I packed up and left the house. I headed to the city library, Jason's favorite place. The library still used an old-fashioned system, with borrower's cards in each book. Whenever someone borrowed a book, they had to write their name and the borrowing date on the card. This meant I could see the names of everyone who had borrowed a particular book. I went straight to the children's section and began flipping through books, scrutinizing the names on their borrowing cards. Ethan loved reading. In my past life, shortly after we brought him home, he had mentioned several classics he'd read. When I asked him where he'd read them, he said it was at a neighbor's house, but my intuition told me that his love for books, and the books he read, was likely connected to Jason. Jason had occasionally lent me his library card, so I knew most of the books he borrowed. This meant he wouldn't have used his card to borrow these books. But could it have been this real mom they mentioned? I combed through the borrowing cards of various books, searching for patterns. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but I noticed something peculiar. 2 names appeared on the cards of multiple books at different times. One of those names made my heart skip a beat. Yaosu. That surname was too coincidental to ignore. Jason Joe. Yaosu. Ethan Joe. Could it be? I knew a surname alone wasn't enough to prove anything. I needed more evidence. When I returned home, I saw Susan cooking in the kitchen. This time, I didn't offer to help like I used to. In the past, I had never done much housework. We had a housekeeper for that. But after Susan moved in, she insisted on doing the chores herself, always claiming she wanted to save money. Under Jason's persuasion, I'd eventually agreed to let her take over. I had no choice but to let the housekeeper go. Helen, Mom feels that since this house is technically yours, having her do some chores will help her feel at ease. Jason Joe explained. Technically, he wasn't wrong. Our home was purchased by my parents long before we got married, and the title deed was under their names. Jason's words sounded considerate, but Susan was his mother. I could hardly expect her to take orders from me. So, whenever I came home from work and saw her busy cooking, I would step in to help. The result? Over time, I ended up doing nearly all the household chores. But today, I had no intention of lending a hand. Susan was clearly displeased, making exaggerated noises as she worked in the kitchen. After dinner, I heard her loudly clattering dishes as she washed them. Ethan, ever the polite and obedient child, spoke up. Uncle Jason, Auntie Helen, let me help Grandma wash the dishes. I often help at home. I patted Ethan's head and said softly, you shouldn't call her Grandma like that. She's still very young. Calling her Grandma might make her feel old. Ethan, taken aback, froze. He was only 5, after all, and timidly hid behind Jason. Right then, Susan came out of the kitchen. Seeing us all sitting on the couch, she immediately started rubbing her lower back and lamenting. Oh, I'm getting old. A little work, and my back starts aching. I pretended not to understand her complaint and replied innocently. You're right. You do look older now. This child calling you Grandma is actually quite fitting. Susan's lips twitched as she struggled to respond. She likely didn't dare contradict me outright, fearing that I might retract my acknowledgement of her as Ethan's grandmother. Still, she was clearly frustrated, though she wasn't that old, having given birth to Jason at a young age. Her appearance and penchant for dressing up had always earned her compliments about looking youthful. Now, being called an old granny clearly didn't sit well with her. Jason, on the other hand, seemed delighted. Helen, does this mean you've agreed to adopt Ethan? Let's start the process together. No need, I said lightly. I have a friend who's familiar with adoption procedures. I'll gather the necessary documents and handle it directly. Jason, knowing that most of my friends were influential department heads, didn't question me further. Remembering the name he had just mentioned earlier, I casually asked, the boy's last name is Sue? Jason's smile faltered slightly, and his expression grew cautious. He nodded. Yes, Sue. Who does he take his last name from? His father or his mother? I pressed. His grandmother, Jason replied smoothly, as if he had rehearsed this answer. She raised him alone. I thought it best not to change his name so he wouldn't have trouble adjusting. That's why we call him Ethan Sue. What do you think? I nodded, feigning admiration. Jason, you're so thoughtful. You're really such a kind person. Jason, visibly pleased, leaned in as if to hug me, but I sidestepped him. Awkwardly, he chuckled and tried to play it off. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. Taking out my phone, I accessed a spyware app one had secretly installed on Jason's phone, a precaution I had taken some time ago. I eagerly sifted through his chat logs and call records. Among the nearly 4,000 contacts in his phone, one name stood out to me, Yao Su. She was listed under the contact name colleague. There were no chat messages between them, but my hands trembled slightly as I clicked into her profile. Her profile picture was likely her own. She appeared gentle, with long, straight, pale green hair, radiating an air of serenity. Her posts were filled with photos of herself, all perfectly ordinary snapshots of daily life. Her presence seemed harmless, but my gut told me otherwise. There was no trace of a child in her social media activity, but I refused to believe in such a coincidence. Early Sunday morning, Jason Joe was called back to the office for overtime. He hurriedly ate a couple of bites of breakfast before leaving. Susan, on the other hand, couldn't help but sneer at my leisurely pace. With a sarcastic tone, She remarked. Jason really has it tough. He can't even rest properly on the weekend. You sure have it easy. I swallowed the bite of bun in my mouth and gave her a radiant smile. Well, that's the privilege of being a graduate from a top university. I just have a life of ease, I suppose. Jason, on the other hand, doesn't have the same academic background, and since you can't offer him much support, he has no choice but to work extra hard to make up for it. Susan's face turned pale, then red. Her hand holding the chopsticks froze mid-air. She wanted to retort, but there was nothing she could say, because everything I said was the truth. Previously, I had always been considerate of their feelings and never voiced these facts aloud, but today I had no such reservations. After breakfast, I went to visit my parents' house. I had nearly forgotten what day it was until my mom's morning call reminded me. Today was the day my parents planned to transfer the ownership of the house we were living in to Jason and me. Jason had never explicitly brought up this matter, but his actions always betrayed how much he cared. Whenever he had a drink at a work event or worked late into the night, I would urge him not to push himself so hard. Our salaries were more than sufficient to support our family, but he always replied that he felt uneasy living in a house owned by my parents and wanted to give me a home of my own. Back then, I was deeply moved and assured him he didn't need to think that way. My parents had never looked down on him, and as their only child, there was no need to fuss over such matters. But Jason was insistent, always working tirelessly. Over time, my parents grew concerned that the situation might strain our relationship. So after years of consideration, they finally decided to transfer the house to both our names. When I arrived at my parents' home, I saw my dad, as usual, taking a handful of pills. I swallowed my grievances, unwilling to burden them. My parents were getting older, and learning about Jason's illegitimate child might be too much for them to handle. So, I fabricated an excuse, urging them to delay discussing the house transfer. Though my dad seemed suspicious, he didn't press me further. When I returned home, Susan greeted me with a fake smile and a cutting remark. Oh, the busy bee is finally back. Out all day without a trace. Thank goodness for Ethan. He's been such a help around here. Without looking up, I coolly countered. If I weren't busy, would anything get done? It's not like the adoption papers will magically sort themselves out. Jason's face lit up with excitement. He quickly walked over to help me with my bag and shoes. Susan, on the other hand, lost her composure. She immediately followed up, her tone suddenly sweetened by several degrees. So, it's all set then? Can Ethan finally be added to our family registry? I glanced at her and let out a dismissive laugh. Do you think these government offices are run by your family? You don't just snap your fingers, and it's done. The Zhou family doesn't have anyone influential to help. Of course, I have to rely on my connections and ask my friends for favors. Susan's face darkened at my words, and even Jason looked uncomfortable. In the past, I had always yielded and accommodated their fragile egos, never revealing what I had to do behind the scenes, but they had taken my tolerance for granted. Jason recovered quickly, pretending nothing was amiss. Helen's right. These things take time and aren't easy to handle. I sat on the couch, rolling my neck as if exhausted, and delivered the line I had prepared in advance. This matter isn't easy to resolve. Even with my friend's help, he'll have to pull some strings, and it'll probably cost some money. Jason had researched adoption procedures before and knew how complicated it could be, especially since Ethan technically had living relatives. He didn't object to my statement and instead eagerly asked, "How much will it cost?" $50,000. I replied evenly. What? Susan was the first to react, shooting to her feet in outrage. That's robbery, Susan exclaimed, her voice shrill. Why would something like this cost so much? Isn't he your friend? Is your friend trying to scam you or something? Jason didn't voice his agreement, but he also didn't object. His silence made it clear he shared her sentiment. I couldn't help but let out a cold laugh. In my past life, my friend, Charlie, had spent a significant amount of money helping me sort out the adoption paperwork. Worried that it would put financial pressure on Susan and Jason, I had quietly taken the funds from my dowry to cover the costs. But this time, I wouldn't offer them a cent. If you think it's too expensive, then forget it. Charlie doesn't pocket that money. It's used to grease the wheels. If it's too much, we can just keep things as they are. Why do we even need that title anyway? I had deliberately thrown out the figure of $50,000. Most of Jason's and my savings were tied up in investments or fixed deposits, which couldn't easily be liquidated. We simply didn't have that much cash on hand. The only readily available money was Susan's personal savings, which she had been hoarding as her retirement fund. Susan never had a formal job, so she didn't have a pension or retirement insurance. Ever since moving in with us, she had frequently lamented her bad luck in life, often comparing herself to my parents. Your mom and dad are so fortunate. When the time comes, they'll have plenty of pension money and live comfortably, was one of her favorite refrains. Though Jason and I reassured her that we would take care of her, she continued to put on a pitiful face. Eventually, Jason suggested we give her $1,000 a month as a gesture of filial piety and as compensation for her help around the house. I had initially been against the idea, but after countless rounds of their mother-son routine, I gave in. With our incomes, the money didn't matter much to me. Over time, Susan managed to save up a decent amount from these monthly payments, but now, I intended to pry that money back. Leaving the three of them with their conflicted expressions, I returned to my room and took out my phone. I checked Jason's phone activity again, but there were still no messages exchanged with the Yao Su. It seemed like it was time for me to visit Jason's office. The next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. I vividly recalled how, in my past life, Ethan had gone out of his way to impress me after I agreed to adopt him. But now, he seemed indifferent, barely speaking when I was around. Susan's protective instincts kicked in. She kept piling meat onto Ethan's plate, urging him to eat more. "You're not leaving the table until you're full," she insisted. I merely smiled, watching the show without interfering. In my previous life, shortly after bringing Ethan home, I had taken him for a full health checkup. The doctor had warned me that his blood sugar levels were abnormally high. If left unchecked, could lead to diabetes, requiring lifelong insulin and potentially stunting his growth and development. I had taken the doctor's advice to heart and strictly managed Ethan's diet and exercise. High-calorie foods like cake and fried chicken were limited, and I enrolled him in basketball and swimming classes to encourage physical activity. But to Susan, my efforts were seen as stinginess and cruelty. She accused me of depriving the child of good food, convinced that children couldn't get diabetes and that doctors exaggerated problems just to make money. Ethan, too, began to fear me, and even Jason had moments where he sided with them, pressuring me to relent. But I stood firm for Ethan's health, patiently explaining the risks. Eventually, though Susan never fully understood, Jason grew half convinced, and Ethan thrived under my care. Thinking back on those times, I couldn't help but feel a mix of bitterness and resolve. I watched Ethan Joe gulping down fried chicken and soda, then slowly looked away. This time, I wouldn't intervene. I would watch with my own eyes as, without my care or intervention, and by their own standard of loving parenting, Ethan grew up to be whatever they made of him. As I was heading out, Jason Joe stopped me. He had apparently discussed the matter with Susan the night before, and decided they would use the $50,000. However, with most of our money tied up in the bank, he put on a troubled expression, hemming and hawing, clearly expecting me to offer a solution, whether by dipping into my dowry or asking my parents for help. In the past, he had always found excuses to make me volunteer money for various needs, whether it was to help some relative back in his hometown with medical bills, to upgrade his car, or even to impress his boss with lavish gifts. It didn't take long before he had completely squandered my dowry. Only when there was nothing left did he finally stop pestering me about it. This time, I merely observed him with a cold gaze, saying nothing. Seeing my silence, he grew impatient and finally spoke. "We can't ask Mom for money, can we? It wasn't easy for her to save up." "Then forget it," I replied evenly. After all, even if Ethan isn't officially registered as a member of the Zhou family, isn't he already part of it? My words carried a pointed undertone. Jason froze, stunned for a moment. I finished calmly. "Think carefully about the child. I need to give Charlie a response today." By the afternoon, Jason called to inform me that both he and Susan had agreed to use Susan's $50,000 savings, but only on the condition that the money would be returned once our bank investments matured. I readily agreed, though I knew they'd never get the chance to see those investments mature. At noon, I left work early and headed to Jason's office. In my past life, he had climbed the corporate ladder in the finance world by stepping on me and my family's connections, eventually becoming the regional general manager for Greater China. Everyone knew that people without family money had no business entering the finance industry, but Jason, arrogant as ever, insisted on pursuing it. Before meeting me, his poor performance had nearly cost him his job. It was only because I called in favors from friends, classmates, and relatives to secure clients for him that he finally gained a foothold in the industry. I never expected that the man I had supported would turn into a wolf who bit the hand that fed him. It was lunchtime when I arrived. I walked straight to Jason's workstation. When he saw me, he looked surprised. After all, it had been almost 3 years since I last came to see him. In those days, I used to visit him often, bringing lunch so we could eat together or waiting to leave work with him. Sometimes, because many of his clients were my connections, I would accompany him to meetings. Back then, he had said to me, "Helen, every time I know you're coming, I can't focus on work all morning. You're my biggest distraction, and my biggest motivation." He had said it with such a loving expression that I'd fallen for it, believing his sweet words. To avoid disrupting his work, I stopped visiting altogether. Now, however, when he saw me, his face flashed with panic, though he quickly masked it. His tone when he spoke to me bordered on accusatory. "Why are you here? Am I not allowed to be here?" I countered. My sharp reply seemed to jolt him back to reality. He forced a smile, trying to smooth things over. "I'm just surprised. That's all. Come on, let's go out for lunch," he said, eager to get me out of the office as quickly as possible. But I had no intention of playing along. "No need," I replied casually. "I've already ordered takeout. It'll be here soon. Let's go to the lounge downstairs." This building had many employees, and most chose to eat in the lounge. After we sat down, Jason tried to probe my reasons for visiting. "So, what brings you here all of a sudden? Why, are you worried I came to check on you?" I asked with a slight smile. I looked at Jason with a faint smile, my expression calm and unbothered. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly in discomfort. "Why would I mind? Of course. I hope you're checking up on me. The more, the better," he replied, forcing a laugh. The lounge quickly filled up with employees, and then I saw her, a familiar face. Yao Su entered and sat down at a table not far from us. Alone, Jason's expression remained perfectly composed, not betraying a single trace of emotion. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye as she ate her lunch, then suddenly said, "Oh, by the way, I'm pregnant." My tone was calm, neither too loud nor too soft, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. That moment, Yao's hand slipped, and her spoon clattered loudly to the floor. Jason instinctively turned to look, only to quickly avert his gaze. Yao's noticeable reaction drew the attention of those around us, but Jason dared not openly acknowledge it. His behavior screamed guilt, as if he were saying, "There's no silver buried here." Jason frowned and leaned closer to me, lowering his voice. "Helen, what are you talking about? How could you be pregnant? We were just joking. No need to scare me like that." I responded just as quietly, my tone light, but my words deliberate. Jason seemed momentarily stunned, his handsome features twisting in confusion. I didn't entertain him further, focusing instead on my meal. By now, I was certain Ethan's mother was indeed Yao Su. Jason came home very late that night, no doubt busy explaining everything to Yao. Meanwhile, I had a productive afternoon myself. Susan's $50,000? I had her withdraw it all in cash and hand it directly to me. I also uncovered some details about Yao. She worked in finance, as a clerk in the accounting department. What made this even more interesting was that most companies strictly prohibited workplace relationships between employees in accounting and marketing due to potential conflicts of interest. Jason, of course, worked in marketing. Back at home, Susan's expression was sour during dinner. She glanced at me several times, clearly wanting to say something but holding back. Finally, clutching Ethan, she sighed dramatically. Poor people like us really don't have it easy. It took me so many years to save that money. And now it's all gone. $50,000. My heart aches. When I didn't respond, she turned to me directly. Helen, don't take it the wrong way. I'm not like your parents. If it were them, they'd hand over 50 grand without even blinking. But for me, it feels like half my life has been taken away. The moment she mentioned my parents, I understood her real intent. She wanted to guilt me into borrowing money from my family, or at least promise to pay her back someday. But I had no intention of playing along. Smiling sweetly, I replied, well, this child is part of the Zhou family, not the Jiang family. After all, he's your biological grandson, isn't he? Surely spending a little money on him isn't too much to ask. I deliberately emphasized the words biological grandson, watching as Susan's expression darkened. Then, turning to Ethan, who was staring at us with wide, confused eyes, I said with mock concern, Ethan, your grandmother is upset because she spent too much money on you. She's feeling so distressed that it's making her physically unwell. You'd better behave yourself, or she might kick you out of the house. Ethan froze, his lips quivering as tears welled up in his eyes. Before he could start crying, Susan hurried to console him, frantically waving her hands. Nonsense. What do you mean? Bought? My dear grandson, don't cry. Grandma would never kick you out. This is your home. I was thoroughly satisfied with the chaos my words had caused. Leaving the table, I placed my bowl down and quietly returned to my room, leaving Susan to deal with the fallout. The day before Valentine's Day, Jason announced that he would be traveling out of town to meet a client and wouldn't be back that night. But I knew today was Yaosu's birthday. Last year, around this time, she had posted on her social media about not wanting to spend her next birthday alone, accompanied by a picture of her forlorn half-smiling face. Thinking back to this time last year, I had suddenly gotten 2 tickets to a renowned pianist's concert and insisted Jason accompany me. At the time, he mentioned he had to chase after a big client deal. I remember feeling torn, sympathizing with him for working so late while also wanting him to spend time with me. Ultimately, I didn't push him to go with me and even promised to help him land a major deal through my connections. This year, though, Jason was determined to spend Yao's birthday with her. Don't worry, Helen, Jason assured me before leaving. I'll definitely be back for Valentine's Day. I smiled as I saw him off. That evening, Yao updated her social media with a post. Love lets me endure all grievances. A happy day. I hope next year's birthday will be spent with family. The attached photo was cautious, showing no sign of Jason. On Valentine's Day, while Jason was supposedly on his way back, I had already seen pictures of him and Yao together. They were dressed in matching outfits, looking blissfully in love as they checked into a hotel, held hands at dinner, and behaved like an ordinary married couple. I thought I would feel anger or heartbreak, but when I saw it, I felt nothing, only a calm, icy detachment. My sorrow and fury had long since been replaced by the resolve to make them pay. The adoption paperwork for Ethan Zhou was finalized. Guided by my deliberate redirection, the neighbors didn't assume, as they had in my past life, that Jason and I were the ones adopting him. One day, Susan was playing with Ethan in front of the kindergarten when she saw me returning home. She eagerly waved me over. The paperwork is done, right? That's such a relief. I was just telling them how I finally have a grandson. Susan's face was full of pride as she called me over, urging me to show the registration papers. The neighbors gathered around, curious. But when the papers were opened, Susan's expression froze. Listed under Mother was her name. What's going on? She stammered, feigning surprise. I said, oh no. Did the staff make a mistake? How did it end up listing you as the mother? That's not right. We'll have to get this fixed immediately. No. This won't do at all. Susan panicked, clutching the papers. I pretended to look troubled. But these things are hard to change, aren't they? And who knows how long it'll take. The kindergarten's spring enrollment is starting soon. If we delay, Ethan might miss it. Why not just leave it as it is? After all, we're all family. Does it really matter under whose name it is? The neighbors chimed in. agreeing with me. Exactly. It's all the same since he's adopted. Having him under your name might actually be better. It won't interfere with Jason and Helen's future children. The neighbors had already found it odd that Jason and I adopted a child so suddenly, and this explanation seemed to make more sense to them. Susan was at a loss for words, stammering, "But this will mess up the family hierarchy." "What's there to mess up?" a helpful neighbor quipped. "You're too young to be a grandma anyway." The conversation attracted Ethan, who had been playing nearby. A neighbor pointed to Susan and said, "See, this is your mom now." Ethan, who had been growing noticeably chubbier recently, looked up in confusion, not quite understanding how his grandmother had suddenly become his mom. Just then, Jason returned from work. The neighbor turned to him and laughed. "Look, your little brother's home." Jason's face turned ashen, his expression like he'd been struck by lightning. I had to fight back a laugh at the absurdity of it all. After the commotion died down, the four of us returned home. Despite the chaos, I was in excellent spirits. Susan, however, was clearly distraught. Her beloved grandson had suddenly become her son, and her son had become her child's brother. How could she possibly accept such humiliation? Feigning concern, I comforted them. "Let's focus on getting Ethan enrolled first. We can always change the paperwork later." They had no choice but to begrudgingly accept the situation for now. After that, Susan refused to take Ethan out in public, as everyone insisted he call her mom whenever they saw her. Susan was furious. Jason, too, had started avoiding taking Ethan out together to minimize the awkwardness of public addresses. This was a stark contrast to the doting father he had been in my past life, picking Ethan up from kindergarten, taking him to amusement parks, playing the role of the perfect dad. But the change wasn't just about the awkwardness of titles. His work was taking a toll as well. One evening, Jason came home looking utterly exhausted. After pacing around for a while, he finally spoke to me. We had been giving each other the cold shoulder for days. Ever since the household registration issue with Ethan, I knew exactly why he was talking to me now. His major clients had abandoned him and moved on to others. "Helen, weren't those people your friends? Can you talk to them again for me?" he asked hesitantly. I shook my head, feigning helplessness. "Didn't you tell me to stay out of your work? So I stopped keeping in touch with them. What happened? Weren't you supposed to maintain those relationships?" I added fuel to the fire. In the past, Jason had borrowed my connections to build his career, but he hated the idea of anyone thinking he was climbing the ladder through me. He had explicitly told me to distance myself from my contacts. Now, faced with trouble, he remembered me. Jason's expression darkened at my response, but he had no choice but to leave it at that. Recently, he had been vying for a deputy manager position, but the pressure was mounting. Losing key clients was only making things worse. His face looked more haggard with each passing day. I decided it was time to give him a special gift. I told him I had arranged a meeting with a major client at his office. Jason was elated and eagerly brought me along. As we entered, the odd looks from his colleagues told me my gift had already been delivered. Completely unaware, Jason whispered smugly to a colleague, "Reschedule my meeting later. I've got an important client coming in." His colleague glanced at me, then asked quietly, "Is this someone your wife introduced?" Jason's face immediately clouded. He hated admitting that he relied on me. Before he could respond, a female colleague couldn't hold back any longer. She pulled a stack of photos from the trash and slammed them onto the desk. Some people climb the ladder using their wife's connections, yet still cheat and mess around. Utter scum. She spat. Jason stiffened, barking, "What nonsense are you spouting?" The colleague sneered. "The photos are all here, and they've been emailed too. Are you still going to deny it?" She flung the photos onto the table and walked away. Jason froze, sensing something was very wrong. The curious glances of his coworkers turned to judgmental stares. He bent down to pick up the photos, his hands trembling. Each image captured intimate moments between him and Yao, holding hands, sitting close, and sharing private smiles. Jason didn't dare look up, his mind racing as his world seemed to freeze. The silence was broken by his supervisor calling his name sharply, ordering him to the office. The moment passed. and the murmurs resumed. Meanwhile, played the part of the devastated wife. After slapping Jason hard across the face, I maintained a dazed, broken expression, leaving the office under the sympathetic gazes of his colleagues. Once outside, I got into my car, turned up the music, and hummed a cheerful tune as I drove to my parents' house. There, I laid everything bare. Jason's affair, his illegitimate child, and my plan to divorce him. My parents were shocked, but, seeing that I was calm, they supported me fully. I sent Jason the paternity test results proving Ethan's parentage along with divorce papers, mailing them to his office. Then, I blocked him on every possible contact platform. I didn't need apologies or excuses. I knew Jason wouldn't agree to the divorce easily. He had nothing left without me. He wouldn't even have a place to live. But as his client resources dwindled and his career prospects crumbled, he must have realized the inevitable. Eventually, he managed to get in touch through mutual acquaintances, agreeing to the divorce. I arranged to meet him at the Civil Affairs office. On the day of the appointment, I was accompanied by friends and family for support. When I saw Jason again, he was a shadow of his former self. Gone was the confident, ambitious man I once knew. He stepped off a crowded bus, his clothes wrinkled from the commute. His car, of course, had been taken by me. When his eyes met mine, he stood in silence for a long moment before tears welled up. "Helen, I'm sorry," he choked out, the words hollow and too late. "Can you let me explain? Ethan was just an accident," Jason Joe pleaded, still trying to justify himself. I had no patience left for his excuses. "Enough. Just sign the papers." He stood frozen, his expression pitiful. I sneered. "What? Don't tell me you have an issue with the property division. Helen, after all these years of marriage, do you have to be so heartless?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This agreement demands I leave with nothing. And why shouldn't you?" I shot back. "The house belongs to my parents. The car was bought by my parents. Over the years, you secretly used our joint assets to support your mistress and your illegitimate child. The fact that I'm not demanding compensation is already your good fortune. Be grateful." I wasn't quiet, and the people nearby started staring at Jason with judgmental eyes. "But, no buts." I cut him off coldly. "If you sign the papers, I'll make sure I never interfere with your clients again." Jason had only come here today because he was desperate. His affair had already cost him the chance at a promotion to deputy manager. In a company that banned workplace relationships, Yao had no choice but to resign, leaving Jason to support the entire family. Worse, many of his premium clients had ties to me, and under my pressure, they began withdrawing their business. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place, his career crumbling while his family's livelihood depended solely on him. In the end, Jason signed the papers. Once the divorce was finalized, I held the certificate in my hands. As Jason tried to say something, I raised my hand and slapped him hard across the face. "That slap," I said, "is for what you owe me." Jason, caught off guard, instinctively raised his hand to retaliate, but my friends quickly restrained him. I delivered a second slap. "And this one is for what you owe my parents." Then came the third. "This is because you have no conscience." By the time I was done, my hands were trembling. Amid the commotion, Susan, Yao, and Ethan arrived, adding to the chaos. Susan's wails rose above all others as she cried out, "Give me back my $50,000. Give it back." $50,000? What $50,000? I asked, feigning confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jason withdrew that money himself. It was his card, his transaction. What does it have to do with me? Realizing she had been tricked, Susan screamed and lunged at me, only to be held back by onlookers. Yao stepped in, accusing me. "You've gone too far. I know you hate us, but you've been plotting against us from the start. You've taken all of Jason's money, and now you even want the old lady's savings. Aren't you afraid of karma?" Her appearance was too good an opportunity to waste. I slapped her across the face. "The only money I've taken is mine. Without me, Jason is nothing but a penniless loser. If you want him, take him, and his poverty, with you." Yao clutched her face, her anger boiling over. But before she could speak again, one of my friends yanked her by the hair, causing her to shriek in pain. The scene descended into complete chaos, and by the time security intervened to separate us, the Zhou family members all bore visible injuries, their appearances utterly disheveled. Jason pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice filled with venom. "Helen, you knew about Ethan from the very beginning, didn't you? You're ruthless. You orchestrated all of this just to leave me with nothing." I looked at him coolly. "I just returned you to what you were before you met me. Nothing. But don't worry. This isn't the end." Knowing they wouldn't vacate the house willingly, I sold it at a low price to a real estate agency. A group of workers arrived with the new owner, smashing everything inside and throwing their belongings out. Jason, Susan, and Yao were physically dragged out of the property and warned never to return. The spectacle was so dramatic that it attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood. The chaos that unfolded was caught on camera and quickly spread online, sparking even more heated discussions. Homeless and humiliated, Jason Zhou and his family were forced to move into his company's staff dormitory, a cramped space of barely 200 square feet. The four of them squeezed into the tiny room, their lives difficult and constrained, but they had no other choice. From time to time, I used the spyware program I had installed on Jason's phone to check his messages. I learned that he rarely went back to the dormitory. His absence escalated tensions with Yao, who often fought with him hysterically. The conflict stemmed from the strained relationship between Yao and Susan Zhou, as well as financial difficulties. Susan blamed Yao for being a bringer of misfortune, accusing her of ruining their lives. In retaliation, Yao turned Ethan against his grandmother. Jason, caught in the middle, was miserable. His desperation grew to the point that he began writing me letters of apology, begging for reconciliation. But those fights, I knew, would soon be the least of his concerns. The financial industry, like many others, is rife with hidden scandals, especially when significant funds and performance metrics are involved. I compiled evidence of Jason's workplace violations, fraudulent reimbursements, tax evasion, and falsified records, and submitted it to the company's headquarters. The response was swift. Headquarters issued an investigation notice, and the domestic branch immediately acted, implicating Yao, who worked in the accounting department, and filing a police report against her. Given the illicit relationship between Jason and Yao, the company suspected backdoor dealings and took decisive action. Both were arrested. Accompanied by my family, I filed my own report with the police. I provided evidence of Jason and Yao's conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Jason had taken out 2 life insurance policies in my name, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. I also handed over Jason's private phone number. I had suspected its existence when I noticed Jason and Yao had zero communication on his main phone. It was only logical that he used a second line. The police confirmed my suspicions after gathering evidence from that phone. The records revealed that Jason and Yao had meticulously planned my murder, intending to disguise it as an accident to claim the insurance payout. The officers showed me their chat logs, which detailed their discussions. My suspicions from my past life were confirmed. This was no spur-of-the-moment plan. What shocked me, however, was discovering that they had attempted to execute their plan once before. Right after Ethan was born, that attempt failed due to sheer luck on my part, making them even more cautious in their subsequent schemes. Reading through the fragmented conversations, everything became clear. Their relationship had started simply. Jason, newly married to me, felt deeply insecure about my higher education and better family background. He had married me, as he once admitted to Yao, to avoid struggling for another 20 years. But the ridicule of his friends slowly wore him down. When Yao, a new colleague, approached him with affection, Jason fell into her trap. Keeping a mistress outside our marriage seemed to him like a way to assert dominance over me. In their countless messages, Jason mocked my naivety to Yao. However, when Yao demanded a legitimate status in his life, Jason flatly refused. He admitted openly that he married me for my family's wealth and wouldn't let go of the benefits. That was when their malicious plan began to take shape. Leaving the police station, I felt as though a lifetime had passed. Everything was finally settled. I didn't attend Jason and Yao's trial. My father later told me that both broke down in tears during the sentencing, hurling accusations at each other. Each claimed the other had manipulated them into committing these crimes, shouting and cursing in the courtroom. Meanwhile, I was preparing to move abroad. A promotion and a significant raise awaited me at my company's international headquarters, a chance I had once given up for family. This time, I was determined not to let it slip away. My parents, both retired, decided to join me overseas. When I heard that Jason was sentenced to life imprisonment and Yao to 15 years, I felt nothing. It was what they deserved. Before leaving the country, I took my parents for health checkups. At the hospital, I ran into Susan and Ethan. Ethan had grown into a short, overweight child with darkened skin, a far cry from the spirited boy he had been in my past life. Susan, looking visibly older, was throwing a tantrum at the doctor, accusing the hospital of lying and trying to cheat her out of money. The doctor, clearly exasperated, informed her that Ethan's condition was severe and required immediate treatment. If left untreated, could become life-threatening. A fellow patient, noticing my gaze, kindly explained that the pair had been to the hospital several times. Ethan had collapsed from vomiting and fainting due to his worsening condition. Good Samaritans had brought him to the hospital, even involving the police. However, Susan refused to believe the diagnosis. The patient added, "It's strange. The kid calls her grandma. But their records say they're mother and son. Definitely an unusual family." I smiled faintly and said nothing. After throwing a fit, Susan eventually hunched over and let Ethan away in defeat. I knew they wouldn't be able to afford treatment. Ignorance had once driven Susan. Now, even if she understood, she likely didn't have the means. What happened to Ethan after that was no longer my concern. Once my parents' health results were clear, I quickly purchased plane tickets. Seated on the plane, watching the blue skies outside, I felt an unfamiliar brightness in my heart. As the plane ascended, I knew the past no longer had a hold on me. My future stretched out before me, vast and full of infinite possibilities.